darkness, my old friend.
For decades, fans of Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel have been haunted by the beauty of their music and the mystery of their falling out. Together, they created some of the most unforgettable harmonies in history. But behind the spotlight lay silence, tension, and words left unspoken. Paul Simon, now 83, has finally broken that silence, opening up about the man who was once his closest friend, his fiercest rival, and his eternal counterpart. What truths has Simon carried all these years, and what does he finally want the world to understand about Art Garfunkel? The story of Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel is one etched into the very fabric of music history. Together, they created harmonies so hauntingly beautiful that they seemed to come from another world. But behind the perfection of their sound lay a fracture, one that widened quietly with each passing year. By the late 1960s, the world saw them as inseparable, yet the silence growing between them told a different story. Fans could only guess at the reasons. Was it jealousy? Was it betrayal? Or was it simply the weight of two powerful creative souls colliding? At the heart of the Simon and Garfunkel partnership was a delicate balance of roles. Paul Simon was the songwriter, the craftsman of words and melodies. Art Garfunkel, on the other hand, was the angelic voice that gave those songs wings. Their union was one of contrast. Paul, the meticulous and restless creator. Art, the ethereal interpreter. For a time, it worked brilliantly. Songs like The Sound of Silence and Bridge Over Troubled Water became more than hits. They became cultural monuments. But within that brilliance, tension brewed. The silence that eventually split the duo didn't happen overnight. It built slowly, through countless studio sessions where Paul's perfectionism clashed with Art's detached calm. Through tours where the spotlight shifted unevenly, leaving Paul feeling overshadowed by the voice that carried his words. And through moments off-stage, where their friendship strained under the heavy expectations of fame. By the time Bridge Over Troubled Water was released in 1970, the cracks were no longer hidden. The album soared to unimaginable heights, but the partnership collapsed. Paul, despite writing nearly every word, felt increasingly like a shadow behind Garfunkel's towering vocals on the title track. Art, meanwhile, pursued acting opportunities, leaving Paul to nurse both the music and the wounds of abandonment. The silence grew thicker, colder. What makes this split so haunting is not just that it ended one of music's greatest duos, but that it was rooted in unspoken resentment. Neither man said the words aloud, but the bitterness lingered in interviews, in half-hearted reunions, and in the eyes of fans who longed to see them together again. Now, at 83, Paul Simon finally speaks of this silence, not as a wound, but as a revelation. For decades, he kept his thoughts buried, letting speculation swirl. But why now? Why, after so long, has he chosen to open the vault of silence that defined his relationship with Art Garfunkel? The answer begins here, with a truth that refuses to stay hidden. When people speak of Simon and Garfunkel, they often describe their voices as two distinct sounds woven so tightly that they seemed inseparable. Yet within that union, Paul Simon bore the burden of creation. Every chord progression, every lyric carved with meticulous care, came from his pen. He was the architect, drafting blueprints for songs that would become generational anthems. And while the public marveled at the beauty of their combined artistry, Paul quietly wrestled with the invisible weight of being the engine behind it all. The irony was sharp. Art Garfunkel's soaring tenor was the sound that millions recognized instantly. It was his voice that carried Scarborough Fair into eternity, his delivery that elevated Bridge Over Troubled Water into the realm of the sacred. Paul knew this, and though he admired Garfunkel's voice, He could not escape the creeping sense that his own contributions, his sleepless nights of writing, his endless revisions, his painstaking attention to detail, were overshadowed. The genius behind the harmony, it seemed, was always hidden in plain sight. Simon's brilliance was not only in melody, but in storytelling. He had the rare gift of capturing the human condition in a few simple lines. Loneliness, hope, love, loss. He could distill life itself into words that resonated across borders and generations. Yet when the applause thundered, it often felt directed at Garfunkel's delivery rather than Simon's pen. This imbalance became the thorn at the heart of their partnership. Art Garfunkel, for his part, was not blind to Simon's genius. He often praised Paul's songwriting as unmatched, even admitting he could never have written such masterpieces. But admiration alone could not soothe Paul's resentment. To Simon, Garfunkel's acknowledgement felt hollow, especially when the spotlight consistently bathed the singer while the writer remained in the shadows. The tension reached its peak when Simon began to feel that Garfunkel's presence was no longer essential to the music. The truth was painful. The songs would exist with or without Art. Yet without Paul, there would be no songs at all. This realization bred a quiet fury within him, one that would shape the decades of distance to come. As Paul Simon reflects now, at the twilight of his career, he admits that the harmony they shared was both a blessing and a curse. It was magic, yes, but magic that demanded sacrifice. And for Simon, the cost was often invisibility. There are partnerships in music that feel almost predestined, as though two forces were drawn together by something larger than themselves. Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel embodied that rare alignment. Simon's words, intricate and poetic, found their perfect vessel in Garfunkel's pure, soaring voice. Together, they produced an alchemy that neither could replicate alone. Yet within that magic lay the seeds of conflict, a paradox of dependence and rivalry that shaped their legacy. Garfunkel's voice was unlike any other. It carried a clarity and resonance that could transform even the simplest melody into something transcendent. Songs like For Emily, Whenever I May Find Her became timeless because of the fragile, almost angelic quality of his delivery. To fans, Garfunkel was the voice of hope, of innocence, of longing. And though Simon provided the framework, the soul of the words, the world often remembered the sound before the substance. For Paul, this imbalance was like salt rubbed into a wound he could never quite heal. Yet the dynamic was not one-sided. Garfunkel depended deeply on Simon's writing. Without Paul's gift for crafting songs, Garfunkel's voice risked drifting into obscurity. He was the interpreter, not the architect. He needed Simon as much as Simon needed him. Their careers, bound by invisible threads, could not exist in their iconic form without the other. But in that binding lay tension. For Simon, it was frustrating to feel overshadowed by his partner's vocal presence. For Garfunkel, it was disheartening to feel tethered to someone who resented the very gift he brought. Behind closed doors, their exchanges grew more brittle. Simon's insecurities fueled sharp remarks, while Garfunkel's aloofness often came across as dismissive. They were opposites, not just in their roles, but in temperament. Simon intense and exacting, Garfunkel calm and detached. What once complemented their art became poison in their personal bond. Looking back, Paul Simon has admitted that he admired Garfunkel's voice as much as the world did. He knew, deep down, that his words gained wings only because Garfunkel sang them. Yet that acknowledgement carried its own sting. To depend on someone while resenting them for the same reason is a contradiction that few can bear for long. Now, decades later, Simon speaks with a mix of pride and regret. He sees that the beauty of their partnership was inseparable from its flaws. Garfunkel's voice and Simon's words were two halves of one extraordinary whole. But the cost of that union was a friendship forever fractured. By the late 1960s, the fractures in Simon and Garfunkel's relationship had begun to show, not just in private, but on stage where their artistry was meant to shine. Fans witnessed flawless performances, yet the tension behind the smiles and harmonies was palpable to those who knew where to look. The tours, once a celebration of creative unity, had become arenas of silent battles. Every note, every pause, every interaction between them was weighed with unspoken meaning. What the audience heard as harmony was, in reality, a fragile mask concealing growing resentment. Simon's meticulous attention to detail clashed repeatedly with Garfunkel's more fluid approach. In rehearsals, Paul would insist on countless retakes, adjusting phrasing, tempo, and even subtle emotional inflections. Garfunkel, serene and seemingly indifferent, would glide through, trusting instinct and intuition over meticulous planning. On stage, this tension sometimes manifested as micro-conflicts, Paul's tight control met by Art's effortless interpretation, resulting in a delicate, almost invisible friction that only heightened the intensity of their music. Offstage, the rift widened further. Simon, introverted and intensely private, often found himself frustrated by Garfunkel's ventures into acting and other projects that pulled him away from the duo. It wasn't simply professional jealousy, it was a sense of imbalance, a feeling that their shared vision was splintering. Garfunkel, meanwhile, felt constrained, as though the creative brilliance that Paul demanded came at the expense of their friendship. Their interactions grew more perfunctory, polite but distant, as each man tried to navigate the tension without shattering the fragile bridge between them. The pressure of fame exacerbated the divide. Audiences adored the duo, critics praised their genius, and yet the very attention that elevated them also magnified every subtle difference in temperament and ambition. Simon began to feel that no matter how much he contributed, his efforts would be measured against the public's fascination with Garfunkel's voice. For Art, the constant spotlight became a reminder of the expectations he had to meet, both as a performer and as Simon's partner. As Paul Simon reflects now, he acknowledges that the rift was inevitable. Two extraordinary talents, with such contrasting natures, were bound to clash. The silence that followed their disagreements was not mere avoidance. It was the only refuge from a relationship that demanded more than friendship could sustain. Yet, ironically, the tension that tore them apart also fueled the music that would become immortal. For Simon and Garfunkel, fame arrived like a tidal wave, sweeping them into a world of adoration, scrutiny, and relentless expectation. Their music was everywhere, on radios, in movies, in the hearts of millions. But with this visibility came pressure, a magnifying lens that revealed every flaw, every disagreement, every subtle tension. What should have been a celebration of creativity became a battlefield where personal insecurities collided with public obsession. Fame, in its dazzling light, was also a double-edged sword, cutting deeply into the bond between Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel. The public adored Art Garfunkel's ethereal voice, elevating it to almost mythical status. Critics lauded Simon's intricate songwriting, yet the applause often seemed directed toward the singer, not the creator. This imbalance gnawed at Paul. Every ovation for a soaring note reminded him that while his words gave life to the songs, it was Garfunkel's voice that carried them into the collective memory. The recognition that eluded him fueled a quiet resentment that lingered beneath polite smiles and carefully staged interviews. Meanwhile, Garfunkel faced pressures of his own. Fame demanded constant appearances, interviews, and performances that sometimes conflicted with his personal ambitions. He ventured into acting, seeking fulfillment beyond the duo's music. Yet this independence was interpreted by Simon as a distraction, or worse, a slight. The very success that should have bonded them became a wedge, forcing each man to confront what they valued most: the art, the recognition, or their fragile friendship. Behind the curtain, disagreements about creative control became routine. Decisions about arrangements, lyrics, and touring schedules were no longer simple discussions. They were negotiations loaded with emotion. Each man sought to assert his vision, yet compromise became increasingly difficult as egos and expectations grew. The partnership that had once thrived on complementarity now felt like a delicate balancing act, with fame tipping the scales unpredictably. Simon has admitted that the intense public scrutiny made personal reconciliation nearly impossible. Every statement in the press, every photograph in the magazines, added fuel to the quiet fire of resentment. The more their music soared, the more their relationship strained. It was as though the world's love for them had pushed them apart, turning admiration into an invisible barrier that neither could penetrate. In retrospect, Paul Simon recognizes that fame, while a blessing for their art, demanded a price neither fully understood at the time. The world heard masterpieces, but the men behind them lived in a constant negotiation of emotion, ego, and expectation. For Simon and Garfunkel, success was both a crown and a cage, glorious yet isolating. Every great partnership carries its unspoken tensions, but in the case of Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel, those tensions eventually found their voice in words that could wound as much as they revealed. Behind closed doors, frustrations that had simmered for years finally surfaced, often sharp, biting, and unforgettable. These were not casual quarrels. They were the echoes of creative rivalry, personal disappointment, and unvoiced resentment. Over time, they became part of the lore surrounding the duo, haunting both their music and their friendship for decades to come. Simon, meticulous and exacting, had always been prone to internalizing his grievances. Yet the weight of being both the creator and the less celebrated half of the duo eventually demanded expression. In interviews, in candid conversations, and even in the lyrics of solo work that followed, he began to reveal truths that had long been suppressed. Garfunkel, whose voice often conveyed serenity, sometimes met Simon's intensity with detachment, unintentionally inflaming the tension. Every exchange, even the simplest remark, carried the risk of reopening old wounds. One of the most painful aspects of their feud was how it was perceived publicly. Fans and critics alike dissected every statement, amplifying minor disagreements into supposed betrayals. Each man's words were scrutinized, often stripped of nuance, and the media delighted in framing them as irreconcilable enemies. The duo's silences between albums, tours, and interviews became interpreted as proof of deep-seated animosity. Yet beneath the surface, there remained mutual respect, admiration, and, paradoxically, a longing for the partnership that had defined their lives. Some of the bitterest words came not in interviews, but in music. Simon's later songs carried subtle critiques, laments for collaboration gone wrong, and reflections on the complexities of their bond. Garfunkel's choices, his forays into acting, his decisions to prioritize certain projects, were viewed by Simon as departures from a shared mission, and these judgments seeped into conversations that left emotional scars. What could have been simple misunderstandings became hardened into narratives of grievance. Even as decades passed, the echoes of these words lingered. Reunions were brief, cautious, and often fraught with underlying tension. Each man carried the residue of past disagreements like an invisible weight, a reminder of how fragile collaboration can be, even among the most talented and devoted partners. Now, In his 83rd year, Paul Simon speaks of these bitter words not to reignite old fights, but to finally provide context, to unravel the misunderstandings, and to illuminate the human side of a duo whose music had inspired millions. What he reveals is a story of complexity, of brilliance shadowed by human frailty, and of a friendship that endured, even in silence. The story of Simon and Garfunkel is not just one of music. It is a story of friendship tested, strained, and ultimately redefined. For years, the bond between Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel existed in a delicate balance, a combination of shared history, mutual respect, and creative brilliance. Yet that balance was fragile. The rifts that grew over decades were not the result of a single betrayal or misstep, but of countless small fractures, each one leaving its mark on the partnership. By the time the duo officially parted ways, their friendship was irrevocably altered, and their legacy became a bittersweet testament to both talent and tension. Behind the scenes, Simon and Garfunkel often navigated their collaboration like diplomats negotiating fragile peace treaties. Small disagreements over lyrics, arrangements, or public appearances could escalate quietly into lasting resentment. Each man, proud and principled, struggled with how to express his frustrations without shattering the creative partnership that had defined their lives. The public saw only the music, the perfect harmonies, the iconic performances, never realizing the personal costs behind every note. Their friendship, though torn, left an indelible imprint on both men's lives. Simon often reflects on the complexity of their relationship, the simultaneous love and exasperation, admiration and irritation. Garfunkel, too, carried memories of brilliance tinged with disappointment, moments where words went unspoken but emotions ran deep. They had shared a lifetime of experiences, the exhilaration of success, the pressure of fame, and the intimacy of creating art together. These moments were precious, yet fleeting, overshadowed by the realities of ego and expectation. The legacy of Simon and Garfunkel, therefore, is inseparable from the tension that marked their friendship. The music itself became a chronicle of their bond, capturing not just joy and inspiration, but also the pain, longing, and complexity of two extraordinary individuals striving to coexist in the same spotlight. Every listener who marvels at The Boxer or The Sound of Silence is, in a sense, hearing echoes of both their unity and their strife. Now, decades later, Paul Simon reflects on this torn friendship with a mixture of regret and acceptance. He acknowledges the fractures, yes, but he also recognizes the profound artistry that emerged from their union. The music, immortalized in albums and memories, stands as both a monument to their genius and a testament to the cost of brilliance. Their story reminds us that even the deepest bonds can be tested by fame, ambition, and human frailty. But the art they created together ensures that, though the friendship was altered, their legacy remains untouchable. Reunions are often imagined as joyous occasions, a chance to reclaim what was lost, to recapture old magic. For Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel, however, reunion carried a far more complicated weight. After years apart, the idea of performing together again was not merely about music. It was a confrontation with decades of unresolved tension, old wounds, and the ghosts of missed opportunities. What should have been a celebration of artistry often felt like walking into a minefield, where every note, every gesture, carried the risk of reopening past grievances. The most famous reunion, the 1981 Central Park concert, exemplified this delicate dance. Tens of thousands of fans gathered, eager to witness the harmony they had admired for years. On stage, Simon and Garfunkel delivered a performance that seemed effortless, their voices melding perfectly once again. Yet behind the applause, both men carried apprehension. For Simon, performing with Garfunkel after years of silence was a reminder of the imbalance that had always shadowed their partnership. For Garfunkel, it was a test of patience, an opportunity to measure whether the connection they once shared could survive the passage of time. Reunion also exposed the paradox of their collaboration. The same elements that had made their music extraordinary, the interplay of voice and lyrics, the contrast of temperament and vision, also highlighted the unresolved tensions. Audiences cheered the magic of the past, unaware that every smile and every chord was carefully negotiated, every harmony a delicate act of diplomacy. The pressure of expectation was immense. The world longed for nostalgia, yet the personal reality of their relationship was far more complicated. Simon later admitted that these reunions felt, in a way, like betrayals, not to each other, but to the integrity of their creative journey. Returning to the stage together risked diminishing the authenticity of what they had once shared. It was a paradox. Their music thrived on connection, yet that very connection had always been fraught with unspoken grievances. Each performance, while celebrated, reminded Simon of the costs, the sacrifices, and the misunderstandings that had shaped their decades-long story. Even now, reflecting on those reunions, Simon sees them as moments of both triumph and tension. They were opportunities to honor the music, but also reminders of a friendship forever complicated. The magic was undeniable, yet it came with the weight of history. A history that, no matter how often they sang together, could never be entirely rewritten. Behind the public persona of Paul Simon, the meticulous songwriter, the lyrical genius, lay a man constantly grappling with inner struggles that few ever saw. Fame and creative success came at a price, and while the world celebrated his music, Simon often wrestled with the emotional fallout of a partnership that had defined his life yet challenged his peace of mind. The collapse of his relationship with Art Garfunkel was not merely professional, it was deeply personal, leaving scars that took decades to confront. Simon's reflections reveal a man acutely aware of the paradoxes in his own behavior. He acknowledges his perfectionism, his intensity, and at times, his inability to temper criticism. These traits, while essential to his artistry, contributed to the rift with Garfunkel. Writing, for Simon, was a solitary, almost obsessive process. Hours spent crafting lyrics, revising melodies, and ensuring every word resonated with truth. Yet the very drive that produced brilliance also fostered isolation, leaving him estranged not only from Garfunkel, but occasionally from the simple joys of companionship. There were moments of profound doubt. Simon questioned whether the cost of his ambition, strained friendships, personal sacrifices, and emotional turbulence was worth the legacy he had built. He wrestled with the knowledge that Garfunkel's angelic voice had brought his words to life in ways he could not replicate. And this duality, gratitude intertwined with envy, complicated their relationship further. Every success was tinged with the quiet ache of what had been lost, the friendship left in fragments, the intimacy of collaboration replaced by distance. Yet, in these private struggles, Simon also found clarity. Time allowed him to reflect on the human side of their story, the shared triumphs, and the lessons learned from conflict. He recognizes that their tension was part of what made their music extraordinary. The friction, the difference in temperament, the interplay of voice and word. All of it shaped a legacy that endures. Simon now speaks with a mix of honesty and humility, revealing not bitterness, but understanding. At 83, Paul Simon's reflections are both confession and celebration. He honors the music, the partnership, and the man who once shared a stage with him, while acknowledging the personal battles that defined decades of their relationship. In revealing these truths, Simon not only illuminates the complexity of their friendship, but also offers a rare glimpse into the mind of a man who has lived fully within both genius and regret. After decades of silence, speculation, and half-told stories, Paul Simon has finally spoken openly about Art Garfunkel. At 83, he approaches the truth with a mixture of candor, reflection, and a rare vulnerability. What emerges is not a tale of animosity or betrayal, but a nuanced understanding of two extraordinary men whose shared brilliance could not always coexist peacefully. Simon's revelations lift the veil on the complexities behind the music, offering fans an unprecedented glimpse into the heart of one of the most celebrated duos in history. Simon admits that much of the tension stemmed from a combination of personal temperament and professional pressure. He recounts moments of frustration when artistic visions clashed, when pride and perfectionism created invisible walls between them. Yet he also acknowledges the debt he owes to Garfunkel's voice, recognizing that without it, his carefully crafted lyrics would have lacked the transcendent quality that immortalized their songs. There is no lingering bitterness in his words, only an honest accounting of decades of collaboration, rivalry, and shared triumphs. He reflects on the irony of fame. The world adored their harmonies, yet that very adoration intensified personal strain. Every standing ovation, every hit record, magnified the disparities between their contributions, and over time, small grievances became defining moments of distance. Simon's truth is that these challenges were as integral to their story as the songs themselves. They shaped not only the music, but also the men, forging resilience, insight, and a profound understanding of human complexity. Perhaps most revealing is Simon's acknowledgement of time's role in perspective. Age has softened resentment, replaced impatience with empathy, and allowed him to see the partnership in its entirety, both the brilliance and the imperfection. He recognizes that Garfunkel was not an adversary, but a collaborator, a counterpoint, and an essential part of a creative equation that produced music for the ages. The reconciliation is internal, a personal acceptance that honors their shared legacy without rewriting history. In the end, Paul Simon's revelation is both simple and profound. The story of their partnership is not defined solely by separation or silence, but by the extraordinary art that emerged from it. He leaves fans with a truth long withheld. Greatness often comes with struggle. Beauty is inseparable from imperfection, and understanding sometimes arrives only after a lifetime of reflection. Their friendship may have been torn, but their music, and the story behind it, remains timeless, a testament to the power of creativity, connection, and the courage to finally speak the truth. Paul Simon's reflections close a chapter decades in the making, revealing the humanity behind legend. Their music endures, enriched by the complexities of friendship, rivalry, and reconciliation. For fans, it's a reminder that behind every masterpiece lies a story waiting to be told, sometimes only after a lifetime.